Hello, everyone. I'm Maureen Lowe. I'm the founder and president of Financial Technologies Forum, also known as FTF. I'm the editor-in-chief of our online news service, also FTF News. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar, How to Be Smart About UMR Margin, produced by FTF and sponsored by SmartStream. As many of you are well aware, the regulatory requirements for Uncleared Margin Rules, or UMR, are fast approaching. From discussions on prior FTF webinars and at various FTF events, it's clear there are still a lot of unanswered questions and concerns about how to tackle compliance. Phase 4 firms must face a September 2019 deadline, and Phase 5 firms face a September 2020 deadline. Many firms, however, are still not prepared for these upcoming deadlines. That being said, as firms race to comply to the new margining levels of the over-the-counter derivatives transactions, it's best for firms to take a step back and figure out how to establish a competitive advantage instead of stampeding ahead without thinking about the end result. Aside from reviewing providers and options, firms need to ensure they have the right operational framework in place, as well as utilize margin calculation and monitoring analytics to make sure they stay under the thresholds. Over the next 60 minutes, we will cover why the Uncleared Margin Rules exist, who and what is covered, key obligations, and the complexity of compliance and related issues. Before we get started, however, I just want to go over a few administrative details, starting with CPE credits. Eligible participants can receive 1 CPE credit for listening to today's webinar. In order to receive the credit, however, you must stay on the line for the entire duration of the call and participate in all 3 polling questions we're going to be asking, including the one that you're seeing on your screen now. So if you have not done so already, please do take a moment and indicate if you would like to be considered for CPE credits, and we ask that you only request them if you are required to do so by the NASBA. And credits can be issued to those listening to the live event and not the recorded version. While we're waiting for some additional people to answer, I just want to go over the event console a little bit. You'll see there's a Q&A window open to the left of your slides where you can submit questions at any time throughout this webinar. And we do advise that you take the opportunity today to ask our experts questions. We will be addressing these questions at the end of the webinar in the last 10-15 minutes or so. And just so that all the attendees listening today are aware, they are anonymous. They are not seen by the other attendees, just by the speakers. If you are listening to the on-demand or recorded version of the webinar, you can still submit questions through the console, and they will be emailed to us accordingly. And finally, in your resources window, you'll see we've provided a PDF of today's presentation to download, as well as some other white papers and relevant information, including the recent announcement of the SmartStream and Cassini partnership. With that, I am pleased to introduce today's presenters. We have Jason Ong. He's the TLM Collateral Management Program Manager for SmartStream. He joined SmartStream in 2015 as a part of the newly acquired collateral management business from IBM Algorithmics. He has 18 years of industry experience to his name. Prior to working at IBM Algorithmics, he managed collateral operations as a VP in the UK division of Deutsche Bank. His roles included being the regional head of disputes management, setting up operations in India for investment banking operations, priority client manager, helping to re-engineer Deutsche Bank's FX operations systems, and managing an FX operations team in Bankers Trust. We also have Liam Huxley. He is the CEO and founder of Cassini Systems. Over the course of his career, he ran investment banking development groups in both the UK and the US before co-founding Syncova, which developed the market-leading platform for hedge fund portfolio margining and financing, which was then acquired by Advent Software in 2011. Liam then founded Cassini with a forward-looking concept of providing the buy side with full modeling of all the new costs and constraints created by clearing and related regulations to allow more efficient trading and portfolio management. So with that, I'm happy to pass the presentation over to our first presenter, Jason.
Hello, good day, everyone. Hope everyone is well. So the first question is why Uncleared Margin Rules? And I thought I'd take a step back first to talk a little bit about why this came about, as I've always thought it important to always understand, the question. So why were the Uncleared Margin Rules created, right? The G20 response to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis is the answer. Right? It essentially forced a hard look at OTC derivatives. When the crisis hit, liquidity dried up because there was no transparency on who was exposed, for how much, and how huge were issues like disputes. Everyone was concerned about credit risk, but there was very little transparency, where even the regulators didn't have much visibility. So the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, BCBS IOSCO for short, created a paper titled Final Framework on Margin Requirements for Non-Centrally Cleared Derivatives, with a set of international standards that would be phased in over time. Right? So how would this help? Well, the CFTC indicates that margin requirements will protect the safety and the soundness and the integrity of the financial system. Requiring parties to collect margin will provide them with collateral to cover the risk posed by the counterparties with open swap positions. Requiring parties to post margin will reduce the ability of firms to take on excessive risk. So then the next question, obviously, is who and what is covered. So for CFTC and prudential covered entities and products, it's the swap entities, so prudential and CFTC regulated, security-based swap entities, financial end users trading with a swap entity, uncleared swaps and security-based swaps, and FX swaps exempted from IM only. And there's a little footnote that I'll cover in a second. On the European Margin Rule covered entities and products, financial counterparties, or FCs, non-financial counterparties above cleared thresholds, so NFC plus, third-party entities, FCs and NFC plus equivalents external to the US, uncleared swaps and security-based swaps entered into after compliance dates, physically settle FX forwards as a result of MiFID II. A note that single stock equity options or index options are delayed until 2020. Swaps are exempted from IM only, and hedging swaps are exempt. So the note here is that for FX products are an anomaly here. Yeah. The footnote is that in the US, physically settled FX swaps and forwards are exempted from IM, but should be included in the ANA, which is the average aggregate notional amount that you're going to be calculating. So while this is what we know, we're not here to provide legal advice, so please be sure to check and confirm with your legal and compliance regulators. Now, going to the UMR Key Requirements, right? So the margin requirements apply to all uncleared derivatives except for some FX transactions, which we talked about earlier. Financial firms and systemically important non-financial firms must exchange variation margin, also known as VM, and initial margin short, and the short for that is IM. The use of thresholds, minimum transfer amounts should be limited. VM is to be exchanged daily. IM is to be calculated using a standard model, so like is the SIM, also a standard initial margin model, or a schedule. IM is to be exchanged on a gross basis and held in the segregated account. So initial margin is a phase-in approach, and you can see on the schedule on the side over here that there's been a yearly phase-in. So ANA thresholds have been going lower and lower. With September 2020, the notional threshold for ANA for exchange of regulatory IM drops from euro 750 billion to 8 billion. So just as a note, there should be about 1,100 new counterparties that will fall into scope at this time, which this means around 9,500 new trading relationships will require a new Reg CSA or to exchange IM. Up to 19,000 potential custody account agreements must be set up to hold the Seg IM collateral. IM is to be covered with non-cash collateral, which is subject then to haircuts, concentration rules, and wrong ways risk checks. So moving on to the next slide, Liam will take on this one, sir.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason's started to outline here, UMR is not just a simple case of having to implement another margin requirement and a posting of collateral. It has various layers of complexity. We'll talk about some more of those in the second section of this presentation when we're looking at the actual capital impact on the firm. But even at the high level, even just at the regulatory and the requirements level, there are a number of layers of complexity that have to be understood and analyzed for your firm as you prepare to implement UMR. So the first one is, as Jason has described, is the FX issue, what we might call sort of FX distortion in terms of the FX products being included in the ANA calculation but excluded from the actual IM exposure and movement. This is something that there has been a fair amount of industry advocacy around in order to try and get the regulations or the guidance clarified to align these two components, but thus far that has not been successful. So as Jason said, this is the position we're in now, but obviously you need to be working with your compliance team and talking to your regulators to confirm what you have to consider as part of your in-scope ANA calculation. But currently it does mean that a large number of firms will find themselves in scope for the Phase 5 $8 billion threshold, but not necessarily actually liable to post margin under those agreements where the FX is then excluded. Another component of complexity is the two-way margining. Traditionally, the buy-side firm, who are the bulk of the Phase 5 of UMR rollout, traditionally they would be margin givers or collateral givers. So where margin or collateral was applied to their CSAs, which would not necessarily be that large a percentage of the agreements anyway, it would be a one-way margin. They would get a call, they would potentially dispute the valuation or agree the valuation and then post the margin. In the new world, you have to be prepared to post and call margin. Those margin amounts are not necessarily symmetric, depending on the trades in the portfolio. And so that needs to be understood and managed. Your collateral management process and workflow needs to be able to handle two-way calls and agreement of amounts. And then you also have to obviously be able to put in place the handling of the collateral that is posted, so your segregated custodian accounts and all the paperwork that goes with those. And then the third point we want to look at here is this issue around the $50 million margin threshold. So this is the ruling that says that if the IM exposure does not exceed the $50 million, then you don't actually have to move or post collateral to meet that margin requirement. But there are a few wrinkles that need to be understood there. One is that the threshold is applied at a group relationship level. So that means that if you are trading as a legal entity against a dealer or a dealer affiliate entity, you're not looking at the level of IM exposure under your current agreement. You are having to look up the tree and look at the overall IM exposure of all agreements between your overall sort of group level entity and your counterpart's group level entity. That also causes a few issues. We've found from our side, clients that we're working with, firms who are asset managers who are managing sort of managed accounts or dedicated assets on behalf of a client, and where they believe that they are falling underneath the threshold because just based on their current agreement. But in fact, when they then go back and talk to their client, they need to get the client to actually, as we said, look at the aggregate level across all group relationship level and then advise whether or not they are eligible to post or not. So there is that extra element of due diligence and discussion that has to be had with your clients for them to advise you whether they are really truly in scope for posting margin or not. The final point on this one is that the $50 million level is also a maximum. It is open to negotiation or discussion between you and your counterparts, again, at that group relationship level. And it can also be taken as sort of sliced up. You can allocate certain amounts of that threshold to specific agreements if that is a way that is preferred to manage it. So a few different points there of additional complexity to be considered as you're putting in place your overall infrastructure to manage UMR come September 2020. So on that point, I'll hand back to Jason, if you want to pick up on the cross-border regulations.
Actually, Jason, before you start, we've had a couple questions come in about the same thing, about some of the points you guys were talking about already. So I just thought it might be best to ask now. There seems to be some questions around the non-cash statement, and someone said earlier, you said IM collateral has to be non-cash. Isn't that subject to CSA negotiation? Why is cash not suitable for collateral? A couple people have asked that.
So I think I can take that offline with Amy, who was asking that. I think initially we had thought that it was not eligible, but as I think Amy was saying, that it is eligible, but there are nuances to it.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so I'm just going to then move on to the next slide around the cross-border, right? So apart from the complexity indicated above, there's also some jurisdictional complexity. So in terms of European countries, third country entities, TCAs, not established in the EU are in scope if they trade with an FC or NFC plus and would be obligated if they were in the EU. Also, it covers any two TCEs if they were obligated and have a direct or substantial effect within the EU. For Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia, there is substituted compliance. Compliance is required if the margin rules in the foreign exchange in the foreign jurisdiction are comparable. In the U.S., prudential regulators exclude foreign non-cleared swaps of a foreign covered swap entity from the scope of the margin requirements. So even if your firm is not directly subject to the regulations, it may need to develop systems to call for and receive collateral eligible IM if your counterparty is required to post IM under regulations applicable to it. So moving on then to, I think there's a poll coming up next, yeah?
Okay, thanks, Jason. Yes. First, a second polling question, actually. We're curious to know who is phase 4, phase 5, out of scope, and who doesn't know. So please just take a moment and interact with our console. Just as a reminder, for anybody who indicated they wanted CPE credits, then you do have to respond to this question. However, we invite everybody who was on the call today to take a moment and just interact with our console. There are a lot of you out there, and it only takes a quick second to respond. We will be sharing the results with everybody, and our speakers will be making a comment or two about them. There we go. I see it picking up a little bit. We're going to close out here in a couple seconds, so please do comment. It looks like so far phase 5 is the top answer. I'm not seeing anybody indicating phase 4. So if you are in phase 4, if you want to respond just so that we have an idea of the different percentages. Oh, there we go. There's somebody. Okay. Closing it out, and I'm going to push the results to everybody, and it looks like phase 5 was the top answer, was 50%. Jason or Liam, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so it seems to bear out that a lot of the firms are in phase 5 that are coming in to listen in on this call.
Okay.
All right, so shall I move on?
Sure.
Okay, so we want to talk about operational readiness then, right? So the idea here is essentially start early. I think that's the thing that we've learned having had phase 1 and 2 clients, you've got to start early because there's a lot of complications that could surface, a lot of hurdles that one has to go through. So we'll be talking about validating funds and scope. We need to prep the documentation, select and set up custodians, and then implement front-to-back SIM calculation and management tools. So the first question is, am I in scope for phase 5? And I think, going back to the poll questions, people seem to know which phase they're going to be in, right? So for non-US, the ANA window is March to May 2020, but firms must conduct estimates ideally well before this. Disclosure 12 months ahead is ideal because of the sheer number of entities coming into phase 5. Now, in the ISDA publication on May 29, 2019, it indicates that for the US, the phase 5 calc period is June 1st to August 31st, 2019. And the directive is to notify as soon as practicable after August 2019. So two-way disclosure so that firms can establish the number of relationships affected. The next thing is to negotiate documentation with each counterparty ahead of the implementation date, a bilateral IM-CSA for each counterparty pair, negotiate eligible collateral schedules. You'd want to understand if the agreement is going to be negotiated electronically, and is your counterpart going to be using SIM or a schedule. Now, for those who have IA, the trade level initial amount, you need to decide if the 2018 CSA handling interaction between IM and IA is right for you. So you might want to consider this approach. There apparently are 3 methods in it. Distinct, which is essentially the sum of the Reg IM with the legacy IA together. Allocated, which is the Reg IM first, and then add in the legacy IA to the highest requirement. And greater of, which uses the highest requirement and allocating it as Reg IA. After that, or in conjunction, you need to do custodian selection. So you need to contact clients regarding the custodians, whether you need to then carry out KYC on your client's custodians. Trilateral account control agreement or similar is negotiated for each counterparty custodian trio. Then there's sometimes a question of going third party or tri-party. And generally, we see buy side going with third party because they generally use cash or a limited number of securities. It's a bit more work in the sense that you have to agree and notify your collateral movements to each party. For tri-party, you would just agree the amount of the collateral call and the tri-party will manage the postings for you. They would generally also optimize the allocations for you as well. Then you need to prepare regulatory IM calculator. So either using the ISDA SIM or a regulatory grid schedule. You'd want to prepare and map the internal data inputs, develop the calculation capacity or set up with a vendor, conduct portfolio matching, ISDA SIM test calculations with counterparties. And then if you're using a non-SIM model, you need to get regulatory approval for that. And then in terms of developing operational capacity, you want to look at IT or other systems development. You'd want to develop a warehouse for multiple IM and VM credit support annexes. And if you don't have this, you'd either need to build it yourself or to engage a vendor. You need to figure out the method for margin call issuances, implement reconciliation processes, monitor eligibility, monitor wrong way risk and concentration limits, derive and apply standard collateral haircuts based on external ratings and credit quality steps under the EU regulations, and then calculate and apply FX haircuts where applicable for the collective IM. So under monitoring, in general, you've got to also monitor your gross initial margin agreements. There's an 8% FX haircut applied on agreements where bucket currency is not equal to the transit or termination currency. Non-cash collateral need to make sure that the credit quality assessment in UMR RTS, which stands for European Market Infrastructure Regulations, Regulatory Technical Standards, is applied. You also want to monitor for wrong way risks, and this is per Article 27 of the UMR RTS. So wrong way risk suggests a firm cannot receive collateral that was issued by the posting party or is closely related to the issuer. And you want to have pre and post booking tests for wrong way risk. There's also monitoring of concentration. So you got to monitor regulatory 15%, 40%, and 50% concentration rules per Article 28 of the UMR RTS. The maximum of 15% of collateral can be issued by a single issuer or issuer in the same group. A maximum of 40% of collateral can be held in core equities and convertibles, and that can be collected from a single counterparty. A maximum of 50% of collateral can be held in government bonds from a single issuer or issuer domicile. And again, you'd also want pre and post booking slides for concentration. I mean, pre and post booking tests for concentrations. Now, because this process is so expensive, optimization of collateral is becoming more and more important. Collateral will be tight. Potentially, 1.5 billion of extra collateral will need to be sourced. So eligibility and concentration rules will require active management, and providing the cheapest collateral will be paramount. All right. And so here we've been working with Cassini to implement their optimization engine to help our clients with this. Liam, did you want to talk a little bit about optimization?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So the key with optimization of collateral is that obviously what you're looking to do is to ensure that you're minimizing the cost impact to your firm and to any sort of carry cost by posting the most efficient collateral you can across all of your agreements, with taking a holistic view, but still factoring in concentration limits, internal liquidity buffers, cost of usage of different forms of collateral. So this goes beyond what might have been a more traditional approach to collateral allocation, which is where people would apply a sort of very simple waterfall model and simply utilize collateral from the top of the list down. The much more sophisticated and efficient way to do this is to define an algorithmic-based optimization. So it's a mathematical algorithm where you define the rules that you're going to apply, which are tailored to the fund by fund and agreement by agreement, reflecting the assets that are available for collateral and the relative costs of those collateral to each fund, with, as I said, the embedding the limits and concentration constraints that you want both internally and that are reflected in your counterparty agreements. So that is the kind of optimization engine that obviously we supply and we partner with SmartStream to implement, and it's able to be both very efficient, tailored to each fund's requirements, but also to then give you a lot of control over things like substitution, rebalancing of collateral, and also going forward and looking at running stress tests against collateral allocation when eligibility or haircut rates change, all of those kinds of tools as well. So in the world of UMR, where you now have a much higher requirement for collateral, as Jason said, it becomes a mandatory requirement to use collateral efficiently and optimally across all open obligations. I think I can say a bit more about that at the end, Jason, but I'll hand that back.
Yeah, thanks very much, Liam. So I think we've got a poll coming up.
Yes, we do. That brings us to our third polling question today. What stage of project implementation are you in for UMR and SIM? Are you researching the situation, creating an implementation plan and estimating a budget, implementation complete and budget allocated, implementation in progress, you're complete, or you don't know? If you could just take a moment to respond. Again, we will be sharing the results with you. As a reminder to those for CPE credits, you're required to answer this, but we do invite everybody to participate. And just as a reminder for those who might have come on a little bit late, we do have the PDF of today's presentation available for your download through the console, as well as some other information, white papers and press releases and things. Okay, we do have a lot of responses coming in. We'll close out shortly, but if you haven't done so already, please do participate in the poll. It looks like researching the situation is in the lead with creating an implementation plan and estimating a budget not too far behind. We have nobody that's complete yet, so if you could respond, that would be great to know. I'm sure everybody will be asking you a lot of questions. Just another couple of seconds. And yes, it looks like a majority of the audience today is still researching the situation. However, creating an implementation plan and estimating a budget isn't too far behind, with nobody complete yet. Liam, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so just looking at these results, I think this reflects very much what we're seeing in our sort of broad range of discussions and across the market as well. So we're talking to a wide range of phase 5, and we've also obviously put some phase 4 firms, but phase 5 from sell-side dealers to the broad range of buy-side firms. And there is, I think there's a growing wave of activity of people and firms now getting projects going to address UMR and address their obligations for phase 5. And I would say this seems to reflect fairly closely, almost 50% in kind of researching stage, trying to understand how it impacts them and how it's going to affect them going forward. I think Jason's already mentioned, one of the key messages we would certainly promote is start early. A lot of firms, I think, there were two factors affecting this sort of slow start. One is that a lot of buy-side firms were, I think, hoping that advocacy would somewhat mitigate the impact of UMR, or that the 8 billion threshold would be raised, or there would be other ways they would fall out of scope. So there were a lot of firms waited for optimistically that would happen, which hasn't. And also, I think we've seen a lot of firms who have not necessarily fully understood sort of the range of impact it has, both on the operational readiness that Jason's been describing, but also in terms of understanding the trading impact. So waited until sort of Q3 or Q4 of this year to kick that off. So I think that's in line with the poll results we're seeing today. What we would say is that the firms that we see now researching or kicking off their projects, a fair number have sort of kicked them off for June 1, are realizing that actually they're a little bit behind the 8 ball. There's a fair amount they need to get done, and a fair amount of analysis before they can be in a place of comfort for the start of next year. So this seems certainly in line with the market, but I think the market sort of has, in general, maybe waited a little longer than would have been ideal to get going, and we would certainly recommend everybody kicks off their projects and certainly gets their research phase done as early as possible.
Thank you, Liam.
Okay. Should we move on from the poll to the next topic?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So moving on, we've talked a fair amount about the background, why these rules are here, how they're going to impact, and some of the operational readiness. The other key thread of this, in terms of, if we go back to how the headline of this webinar, being smart about SIM, the real impact of all of this is not so much just on operational processes and workflows, which are obviously essential and are mandatory for compliance. But the bigger impact is how do you reduce the overall impact on the firm. So that's what we just want to look at a few different perspectives on now. And it touches on 2 or 3 areas. The primary one is having transparency and active management of your margin requirements across all of your newly compliant bilateral agreements. A lot of what we will talk about now also can apply to your existing cleared OTC and your ETD trading activity. And one of the sort of trends we're seeing in the market at the moment as well is that firms are to some degree taking advantage of the UMR regulation requirement to release budget, which they can also use to put in place better controls and workflows around all of their collateralized trading, not just the bilateral. But just keeping the focus on bilateral for now, the other sort of angles to think about are that it's about trading controls, it's about reflecting margin and the related costs as part of your overall trading controls, and we'll think about that in terms of risk and compliance controls, and optimization of margin and collateral on a post-trade basis. So there are different ways we can think about how you can rebalance portfolios and manage overall trading profiles to keep margin at a minimum. So if we firstly think about this concept of the whole trade control process, the key thing here is that traditionally, we've talked about this, margin and collateral management was a end-of-day back-office process, hopefully run in as automated an STP fashion as possible, part of the overnight process with T+1 morning reconciliation and posting. The front office would try to have nothing to do with it and try to ignore it, considering it didn't impact their trading and portfolio decisions. That is no longer applicable, certainly in the large majority of funds now with the impact of UMR. There are still cases where, depending on the fund style, that might still stand good, but generally it's no longer true. So initial margin has to now be considered as part of the overall trade control process. So the first impact of that is that by applying smart margin management, you can minimize the overall drag on the portfolio that is created by the carry cost of collateral. And it's a very simple equation. If you think about having to post cash as collateral, if you're basically under CSAs where the only kind of eligible collateral you have is physical cash or cash equivalents, that effectively is taking out available investable funds and reducing the performance on the portfolio. If you are utilizing non-cash assets, then it's a little bit more nuanced depending on your fund mandate and what other additional sort of activity you or the Treasury Group may be utilizing those assets for. But again, there can be other equivalent costs, for proxy from repo rates or sec lending returns from utilizing those assets for collateral instead of for other activity. So that is something that has to be looked at on a fund-by-fund basis. But overall, the core principle is that by managing, optimizing, minimizing your margin number, you can reduce the necessity of active sort of collateral management down the line. SmartStream management or IM management in general that then requires this to be part of the overall trade life cycle. So pre-trade estimation, trend analysis, forecasting, intraday and ongoing margin monitoring, and then other types of optimization analytics. So we'll just step through a few of those points and explore them a little bit further. So we just look at the next slide. The first principle here, when you're preparing for UMR and you're looking at what solution you have to put in place, is that you obviously need to implement a form of SIM calculation. The key consideration here is that to address what the sort of the larger topics that we just looked at, SIM calculation needs to be a dynamic, on-demand tool that's available throughout your trading day. It's not sufficient for it to be just an overnight sort of batch-oriented SIM calculation, which produces one SIM number per portfolio. That will simply get you as far as knowing how much margin you have to post on your overnight process, but it gives you no other tools to be able to manage your overall impact across the firm and to address some of the other tools that we mentioned. So the first key thing is that you have a calculation solution, whether that's in-house or you're using an external calculation source that can be accessed at all parts of your trade lifecycle. So it is available and integrated into your end-of-day collateral management flow, but it is also integrated into your pre-trade or your portfolio modeling. It also needs to make sure that when you're selecting or implementing your SIM calculation solution, that it has complete asset coverage for the entire range of your bilateral traded agreements and market and currency coverage. And that is not as trivial as it sounds. There are nuances and anomalies with different markets and terms of sensitivity and curve generation, which are sometimes not obvious, and not all valuation solutions do support those. So that's something, again, that needs to be considered as part of your research and your preparation stage. You also need to ensure that you do have a calculation solution that supports the grid model. We haven't mentioned this much, but the UMR rules support either a model-based initial margin or a standard grid methodology. The grid is almost always more punitive than utilizing the SIM model. There are some exceptions where it's actually slightly more lenient, but it is a key part of your SIM calculation solution in that you will need it to provide a backstop for those sort of outlier trades, either due to the trade complexity or the market, where you and your counterparty can't agree on a model-based margin. And additionally, this SIM calculation solution that you implement needs to allow you to run dynamic monitoring and what-if testing, scenario testing, where you can validate different forms of portfolios. So taking this down to the next step, if you think about risk management, as we said, initial margin and SIM needs to be an integrated part of your trade control process, and that includes risk management. Now, one key control that you need to implement is can be termed in different ways. We might think about it as unwind risk. Another term that we use is a sort of marginal margin or a marginal attribution. What we mean by that is being able to analyze across your entire agreement which component trades, so which sub-portfolios or strategies within that agreement would cause a spike in the margin requirement if they were closed out or unwound or hedged out. And the reason this is a really important control is that if you have different PMs trading their own strategies, executing against a common counterpart, those trades with completely different sort of trading intent are going to be held together under a combined portfolio. SIM is a portfolio methodology, so will provide a reduced margin if there are unintended offsets or correlations between those trades, which is beneficial if you have effectively a sort of bidirectional. But then if one of those PMs makes a change to their strategy, which removes some of that offset, you can have an unintended spike in your initial margin. That can be forecast and managed by running these types of attribution scenarios to see where those exposures may sit, and then that allows the risk manager or the treasury to actively manage ahead of time and avoid those scenarios creating any kinds of unintended margin obligation. Equally, at pre-trade time, it is essential that you have transparency over the initial margin impact that will be created by executing against any particular counterpart. Again, it may have two impacts. One might be by having that transparency, you can avoid even breaching the initial margin posting threshold. The second one is that you may be able to mitigate a much higher increase in collateral obligation and therefore carry cost. So if you think about a scenario where you want to put on a particular swap or swaption or something, whatever the trade might be, or a package, and you get quotes from 3 dealers, the quotes will, there'll be some kind of spread between them, and you're looking at what's the best quote. If you then also add into that comparison at execution time, what is the initial margin impact? You may find that on one or more of those dealers, you're going to have a margin reduction or a sort of margin neutral impact compared to potentially, say, on another, a significant margin increase. That will actually change your overall decision over what is best execution. So having the ability to do a pre-trade check, potentially even before you put the trade out for quote, you may even vary the dealers that you want to request quotes from based on that analysis. So these are 2 key risk management controls that come along with implementing the right level of integrated SIM calculation solution and are essential for you managing and reducing impact once SIM comes fully into play. So another aspect is then thinking about these portfolios on a post-trade basis. So another way to mitigate or reduce the SIM exposure is to think about how else you can trade. Now, this is not always possible, depending on the investment mandate, depending on the purpose of the trades. But they very often can't really be done in any other fashion. But there are cases where alternatives can be used. So in some cases, for example, on FX trades, it's possible, or inflation, it's possible to trade cleared equivalent trades rather than bilaterally on a future basis. You wouldn't need to be thinking about replacing any of the existing open trades in your portfolio, because the SIM rules are only going to apply to new trade activity after September 1, 2020. But after that point, by doing a meaningful comparison between equivalent trades and trading routes, you can make a decision as to whether there is a more efficient and less margin-intensive option available to you. Another choice that you should then be implementing post your September 1 date is strategic backloading. The idea here is that you have your open existing portfolio held under the legacy CSA. That can stay as is. You don't need to do anything with that. All your new trades are going to be traded under your UMR compliant CSA. But as you are starting to build up the portfolio under the new CSA, if you run analytics, you may be able to identify, and obviously we have various innovation tools and analytics that do this, but this can be done in-house as well. You may be able to identify trades that would provide risk offset by novating them across from the legacy to the compliant CSA. That is something that should be done maybe weekly or monthly, depending on the churn in your portfolio, but provides a very useful control to reducing and managing that overall IM exposure, and should be fairly non-controversial with your counterparts, because this is a two-way IM situation. So obviously, if you're reducing the IM, you're also helping the counterpart. So one other key message or key consideration, coming back to our theme of being smart about SIM, is that if you are under your $50 million threshold, make sure you stay under it. It's just too easy. We've run various portfolio evaluations and analytics for firms who are coming into scope for phase 5, where they initially sort of start off with discussion saying, we're absolutely sure we're not going to be anywhere near $50 million on any of our agreements, but we'll run the portfolio review. When we run that, we'll find that some of them are at 42 or 45, or very close, and much closer than they expected them to be. And again, depending on the types of trades that are within those portfolios, some trades can actually increase margin quite rapidly as they near expiry and these kind of things. So it is not as easy, simple as to say, I'm under the 50 million threshold, I'm okay, I don't need to worry about it. You need to make sure that you validate your overall maximum exposure, that you run forecasts for your post-September 1 activities and trend analysis to forecast when you might get close to the thresholds, and that if you are able to stay under the 50 million, that you implement all of the measures we've discussed so far to actively manage and stay under that threshold. The last thing you want is for just some unintended trading activity or some unintended unwind to cause a breach of the 50 million, and you then fall subject to either not being able to trade any longer with that counterpart until you can get back under, or having to actually then start to put in place all of the operational and posting overhead. So the smart move here is implement the controls, pre-trade, post-trade, monitor your thresholds, and make sure you stay under them. So I think the last topic here is really just backtesting. Backtesting is something that you need your compliance department to validate and to ensure that they talk to your regulator and validate your obligations. So there are differences between Europe and the US in terms of which entities are subject to backtesting and benchmarking obligations. Certainly in the US, we're working with a couple of dealers who are going through this process now, NFA regulated dealers. And in Europe, we're working with a number of firms who are also putting this process in place. The key thing here is that, again, this is not a one-size-fits-all process. Backtesting is a reasonably nuanced and complex process, and it requires a set of tools and a software infrastructure. It requires a set of appropriate and clean historic data, which you may provide yourself or you may source in collaboration with your vendor partners. And it requires expert advisory to implement the right governance process and the right validation of your portfolios and your P&L comparison, your backtest. So it needs the right level of expertise and the right tool set. And we're happy to have a much longer discussion on that. I think we're getting a bit close on time today to go into all the detail around backtesting and benchmarking. But it essentially does come down to having a flexible calculation platform that allows you to tailor your specific validation and governance process to meet your regulators' requirements. So to wrap up, I think coming back to, this is a diagram representing a very, very high level, extremely high level sort of system architecture. Obviously, SmartStream and Cassini are sort of the sort of systems here that we're discussing. But if you take the labels out of this, the architecture applies regardless of whether you implement this in-house or with vendor solutions. The key thing is that you have your collateral management repositories and workflows. You have your upstream sources of trade information and risk or MPVs. You can supply your own sensitivities, or you can use a calculation platform to calculate them. And then you have your SIM calculation platform, and that is, as you can see from the diagram, integrated with both this end-of-day collateral management and operational workflow, but also integrated with your upstream front office and middle office systems. And that key architecture is that you can then deploy that on premises, off premises, deploy it how you like, that suits your workflows and gives you all of those tools that you need to control and be smart about SIM. Jason, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, so in conclusion, right, UMR impacts operations and trading, and essentially being smart is prepare early, right? I mean, that's the message I think we've been talking about throughout the whole thing. You want to implement two-way IM and collateral automation. You want to make sure that you have some kind of inclusion of this into your trade control processes. And then ideally, you'd want to optimize margin from pre-trade all the way to post-trade. Yep, and that's it for me.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Liam. We do want to get to some questions. We've been having a lot come in. We have a couple minutes left here. But if you haven't submitted a question so far, please do so at this time, and we'll do our best to get to everything. If not, the speakers can address your questions after the webinar is over. And if you want to listen back again, this will be available on demand for a year, and we'll be sending out an email within 24 hours when the recording is available. So with that, let's jump right in. Jason, can you speak to some of the pros and cons of on-premise deployment versus software as a service?
Yeah, so it seems like in this case, a lot of FaceBack clients are considering software as a service as cloud platforms become more acceptable. So essentially, for on-prem, the pros are that you have absolute control of the entire environment. The cons essentially are the costs, because there's not just the maintenance hardware and software, but also the personnel around that. A lot of times, software as a service becomes very appealing because all of that, the software, the hardware, the personnel, all basically is handled by somebody else. But in some ways, some people see that as a con as well, right? Software as a service essentially is much easier to implement, has lower startup costs, but make sure that your data is not commingled, because potentially commingled data might be seen by other people. This is something that we've been hearing very clearly from our clients, and so in terms of a software as a service, we make sure that there's no chance of data being seen by anybody else, so we don't commingle anyone's data with anyone else. And then the other thing is that given that there are changes that are coming, make sure that you can upgrade according to your timetable, because you want to make sure that while you can take frequent upgrades, you also want to make sure that you test and have the ability to test your software against your internal systems.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to come back to some of the questions that were coming on earlier. I don't think Liam had a chance to respond. There have been several questions about the non-cash comment. So Liam, could you talk to just what are the nuances to non-cash, and this is important, for some of the firms that are on now. Is it subject to CSA negotiation, and why is cash not suitable for collateral?
Yeah, so VM is typically cash, but IM is not restricted. IM can be cash, and in fact, we're seeing that a lot of firms certainly plan to use cash, but it's obviously more. I think, as the questioner said, it's open to negotiation with CSA as to what are the eligible collateral acceptable to both sides. So it can be a mix of cash and non-cash.
Okay, thank you. And maybe you can also answer how open are vendors of SIM to open up the architecture for the customer to be able to validate the model?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for all vendors. I can speak for one. That's absolutely expected, I think. So depending on whether or not which side of the equation, in terms of buy side, sell side, and whether you're Europe or US, you may or may not have to formally have model approval from your regulators, in which case you obviously need to supply extensive sort of documentation over the model and the the underlying kind of model assumptions and the data sourcing, etc. Even if you are, say, a buy-side firm that's not mandated to do that, any vendor should be able to supply you or share that information with you. Obviously, it's somewhat proprietary, so it's under the bounds of a sort of NDA or a confidentiality or a license agreement. But the validating, the model is and providing the supporting documentation should be expected from a SIM vendor for sure.
Okay, thanks, Liam. And Jason, we've had this question a couple times as well. How does AcadiaSoft fit in?
Yeah, so AcadiaSoft has been a long-time partner for us. We were one of the first systems to adopt a margin sphere for our clients to do messaging. So we see this as part of a connectivity partnership, right? So we'll continue to be able to then add in functionality that will simplify the entire process with AcadiaSoft. We're also partnering with them to bring in agreements into our system directly as they are working to create to connect to some of the industry electronic digitized platforms.
Okay, thank you. And then Liam, I think we have to wrap up here with this last question. We're a couple minutes over, but we've had so many come in. Will IM be exchanged only on OTC bilateral deals traded after September 2020? Sorry, Liam, I think maybe I was having a little bit of a...
I actually can't hear the question on this end, but I think
okay. Did you want me to ask you again? Will IM be exchanged only on...
Yeah, to answer the question about whether IM is going to only be exchanged on the bilateral trades after September 20, yes, that's correct. I think I have alluded to that in one of the slides. So the existing portfolio can be novated across into the new UMR Compliance CSA, but that's not required. It is only mandated or required that all new trades after the September 1 date are collateralized under UMR.
Okay, thank you, Liam. I think we're out of time for today. I do want to thank everybody who came on and joined us for our presentation. We do have some questions that we weren't able to get to, and we'll have the speakers reach out to you directly. Thank you, Liam, and thank you, Jason, for a very informative discussion.